kind of overview of my work, I focus on how do we talk about tough issues? How do we have the conversations we need to have for democracy to work, particularly diverse democracy, to work on our hardest issues? Part of my history, my initial research, like in grad school, my dissertation focused on national politics, focused particularly on presidents, how they talk about issues. I was doing well as an academic publishing, but all my papers were really depressing because most of my papers were about how badly they talk about tough issues. So then I started my first job. I'm like, I don't really want to write papers for 40 years about how bad things are. So when I got to CSU, I switched my focus from national to local, and I also switched from being a critic to becoming much more of a practitioner. Right? Because in my classes, in our research, we know what kind of talk we need to have to deal with these issues. We just don't see them very much, particularly in our national political system. So the CPD became this experiment of, hey, can we kind of intervene? Can we help people have better conversations? Another way to think about that is I really wanted to research high quality conversations. I just couldn't find any. So I started a center and tried to spark some so that I could stay them, right? So that's kind of how it all works, right? So we've run about 500 meetings over the last 18 years, primarily in Northern Colorado, working a lot with the city of Fort Collins and school districts. I train undergraduate students as facilitators and dedicated courses. So what a CBD meeting looks like, a little bit like this. We'll have 15 tables in a big ballroom, but instead of everyone listening to a speaker on the stage, which isn't always bad, I'm sure today, or like walking up one at a time to microphones, which I can tell you right now is a horrible process this time to help us deal with tough issues. We can split all those people up and have typically 2 of my students at every table, one facilitating, one note-taking, trained generally in collaboration and conflict management and deliberation, and trained specifically on that topic. So my research now is designing processes that help people have these conversations. As you'll see a lot today, my work is really informed by social psychology and brain science. So the easiest way for me to explain what I do is I design processes that try to avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into the best. And so you'll get a good feeling of that as we go through. I'll tell you right now, I have way too many slides and way too much information, right? Because I sometimes give this presentation in an 8-day workshop, and sometimes so this is the shorter version. But instead of deleting all these slides, I'll go through some of them and not some other ones. I won't go into detail, but if something's interesting to you, you have on that other link, right, the full PDF. And additional videos of me going through them slower and so forth. And particularly all of y'all are in Northern Colorado, and I'm right here, and you'll find out it's not hard to get me talking about this stuff, right? So if you want to dig into something deeper as we go through, but I'll be skipping as I go around, right? So I asked y'all this question, which is a question I've been asking probably about the last 10 years. I give lots of talks. And it was, which of these words or phrases best describes kind of the quality of public discourse? I know if I ask this like national versus local, we would be different answers, right? You put them all in the big bucket together. It's always a little nerve-wracking asking this question because if y'all don't answer the way I anticipate, I have to change my whole presentation. But so far, 100 times I've asked this question, I have never been disappointed, or I continue to be disappointed probably, because all the negative ones get picked and very few of the positive ones. I've actually been in rooms of like 80 or 90 that not a single person picked one of the positive ones is the top 3, right? We did get at least one person say high quality informed. No one picked robust, no one picked productive, right? As usual, lately, the top 2 are polarized and mean superiority, or top 3, and dominated by the others. I like to start with this to show we've got work to do, right? My basic concept is democracy requires really high quality communication, and clearly we're not getting it. So a lot of my work is to try to change this. And really, there's a 2-step process. One is to stop doing things that tend to incentivize these bad things, which unfortunately most of our public processes do, in particular our political system, the media system, and so forth, right? And then the second step is, doing different ways of engaging people that actually incentivize some of the things that we want, which is the creativity and kind of higher quality kind of stuff. So again, today is more of the big picture kind of theory getting started. I hope it's the beginning of a conversation. I was here earlier just listening to introductions. So we know a lot of people from towns around Fort Collins that are working on these issues. We want to be a resource to y'all, right? This is the focus of my work, building capacity in local communities to help you have the kind of conversations y'all need to have locally. This is just a list of the topics that we've worked on in the last 15 years. Every single one of these is primarily the community coming to us asking for help. I like to show this because this isn't the ivory tower professor coming to y'all to tell y'all how to talk about issues. Like everything I'm talking about today is from practice, right? It's from actually doing it in the community with real issues. And then how does that kind of engage the research and bouncing back and forth between theory and practice in lots of different ways. So again, as you look deeper on that, if any of those are really interesting to you, right? That's something that you're dealing with a lot. I can certainly talk more a little bit about it. To start off a little bit, something different I'm doing that some of y'all probably heard me give some form of this talk before. So I got some new stuff just for y'all. Quite a few new slides I've never done before today. But I've been doing this statewide tour lately with this program called Development in the Wave, which is a collaboration between the CBD and several statewide news media organizations to help equip local newsrooms to be more of a deliberative kind of resource of conflict, deal with conflict differently. And I start with those, we watched this film called Undivided, it's about polarization. But from my work in 20 years, I see two big challenges, and this is kind of nationwide or internationally, but also locally, and also in organizations, and also in probably Thanksgiving dinner, when we're dealing with relatives in our political climate now. So I see these are the two biggest challenges that we have. One I call information disorder from some new terminology of experts, and then the other is polarization, right? So information disorder is basically this combination of just information overload. Our ability to create and share information has just exponentially exploded, right? This chart here, so this is 2020, this is 2025 kind of estimates, right? These are zettabytes, right? So 1 billion terabytes, whatever that means, right? But you see just how much just noise we're getting, how much information we're getting. The problem is, while our ability to create information and share information has completely exploded, our ability to make sense of that information has not grown that much, right? And actually gotten undermined a lot. Because we need this process of taking all that noise, just raw data, and kind of shifting it to information, so we're making distinctions between equality in a sense, and hopefully that leads to knowledge, which is kind of really actionable stuff that we can use, and that gives us some insights that we can draw on to increase our wisdom and make better decisions, right? We need this kind of process. Quality journalism, quality expertise, universities are institutions that help us do this in certain ways. But the trust in our institutions is kind of collapsed across all institutions that we'll kind of see in a minute, right? The second part of information disorder is just an incredible increase of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Well, how many people that three kind of terms, is that something you've heard before, or is that new to so a little bit of both, right? So misinformation is passing on bad information that you don't know is bad, right? So there's not an intent there. You believe it's true and you're passing it on, right? Whereas disinformation is purposely passing on misinformation, right? That's more of a bad faith actor. You're purposely trying to kind of pollute the information in a way. So there's a few people that pass on disinformation, and a lot of people that trust them pass on the misinformation. But overall, that means all this noise we have, more and more of it is really bad information. That makes it harder for us to kind of go through the response, right? Malinformation is just passing on information with the intent to harm, right? Ideally, we're passing on information with the intent to provide insight, to help people learn, to kind of refine our opinions. But now there's a lot of incentive of, no, I'm passing on information just to, whether that's to win elections or enrich myself or drive clicks or so forth, right? So disinformation kind of brings those two together. The problem again is the institutions we rely on to deal with this kind of stuff are really struggling right now. Right? So higher ed, which is actually pretty high on the list, right? But it only has 18% have a great deal of trust and 30% very little. That's a huge change from just 5-10 years ago. And then down here we have newspapers and television news. Congress is on the very bottom, by the way. I forget. I think like cockroaches are somewhere. So yeah, it's really hard. We're getting more and more information, more and more bad information, and all the institutions that we rely on to kind of help us make sense of that are struggling, right, and becoming targets of this. Right? So when we don't have the processes to do all this, we tend to get this, right? So you can kind of find what you want in the data and kind of bring it together, right? So that's information disorder. And then polarization is the other thing I've spent a lot of time on. The number one answer in the room of how would you describe how we talk about tough issues. So I've got a couple of beliefs on polarization. I have a whole hour long that really dig deep into this if you're interested, just pulling some highlights. So one is I do believe polarization is our number one issue, right? Because when we're polarized, nothing really works. Facts don't matter, right? Having the better argument doesn't matter. We don't have the trust and connection to be able to have the tough conversations. Everyone just talks back. Even if you know you're right, polarization kind of makes that irrelevant somewhat, right? Even though, if you're thinking right now, the other side's fault we're polarized, you might be right, right? But I know that fighting polarization with polarization just increases polarization. And generally, polarization just makes nothing happen. Right? So if your goal is to improve things, you can't just fight fire with fire, right? You have to figure out different ways to change the conversation. Part of the preview of the good news is, as we elevate our conversations, things like facts and quality of the argument start mattering, right? So there's this pragmatic thing of, hey, if we change the way we talk, right? Then all of a sudden, in the long run, you might make more impact. And that's kind of really the story of my work. I decided 20 years ago to be this impartial resource to a community because of all this work. It's not that I'm neutral, it's not that I don't care about things. I professionally serve as an impartial resource because pragmatically, I believe these kind of resources help us actually move the needle on things we care about. So polarization is the number one issue, but it's also greatly exaggerated, right? We're not nearly as polarized today. The problem is the perception of polarization is much more important than the reality. If we think we're polarized, we get all the bad stuff I just talked about. But the good news there is if we're not really polarized, it's mostly manufactured and fake, it's not too hard to undo, particularly in the local community. Right? Undoing it nationally, especially in election year, is really, really hard. Right? But in a local community, you can actually undo a lot of this. It's which identities are you kind of tapping into. So these are just some of the articles I talked about in my longer talk about showing why the polarization is mostly false and exaggerated. This is a great article that did some really good research, and basically people really hate the other side because of things that the other side doesn't actually believe. And the concept now is called perception gaps. When you ask Republicans what Democrats believe or vice versa, they're really, really wrong. So you're really angry at people for things they don't believe. The Hidden Tribes report, it's great, kind of shows, if you probably can't see the details here, but most, the wings are a very small percentage of people. They're also typically the most loud and very active on social media, have lots of bumper stickers. We hear their voices all the time. There's this exhausted majority in the middle that tend not to be part of the conversations. And that's also part of the good news. If you ask people if you're sick of the polarization, you're sick of the division, you're getting huge majority, 80, 90%, right? So there's a lot of people that want things to change, tap into your local community. So another good report. Again, I have links to most of these, or I'll try to add them if I didn't, if you want to dig into any of these. The last point about polarization is legislative, like the strong majorities are sick, so there's a lot of potential there to tap into that frustration, right? And offer them something different. And a big part of the story of the CBD for 20 years has been when you give people an alternative, when you give people a better way of talking about something, they see the value of it and they want to work. So that's what I'm going to do kind of today is I'm going to dig into two questions. One is, hey, why are we so polarized? Right? How do we understand this polarization and division so we can figure out ways of countering it, which is the second part, so then what can we do about it? And obviously, this is all in the context of water literal leaders, right? I should probably start with that, right? This is kind of a skill building thing. My work is every single issue. Right? I do a lot of issues. I've dealt with water a lot. We'll see some examples of it. But one thing I'll end with, and I'll mention here too, is programs like this are exactly what communities need. Right? When you think about the two challenges are information disorder and polarization, this program is specifically designed, maybe without even knowing it, right? To deal with both of those, to help you make sense of the information and pull out insight from all this overwhelming information, but then also to create some relationships and understand each other across different perspectives about water, to undo that polarization, to help you build this common ground that you'll need to take on some of these kind of tough issues. So one of the biggest insight from 20 years of doing this work that I talk about again and again, I've got an editorial at the end of this that you kind of dig into. Communities need these bridging organizations, these mediating institutions. There's so many institutions that divide us. Locally, we need institutions that bring us together. Right? The Community Foundation is one of those, right? The CSU Water Institute, in a way, kind of the way they're doing this kind of work is one of those. Hopefully, the CBD is kind of one of those. And then this program specifically is one of them, right? So we need more of this. I've actually been arguing about how do we model water leaders with lots of other issues. Because we're equipping leaders to be the kind of leaders we need them to be. So getting into polarization, the quick answer of why we're so polarized, or why we seem so polarized, right, are five factors. Human nature being the most important one that I'll spend the most time on, and I'll touch on some of the others as we go through. But the unfortunate reality is our brains are much more wired for polarization and outrage than they are for deliberation and collaboration. Lots of reasons for that. I won't be able to get into all the kind of evolutionary psychology kind of things, right? But I'll touch on quite a few as we go through. These are just some of the books, and I will say, I love books, right? Whenever I was going through grad school and I got frustrated, my wife would take me to the bookstore. Instead, help me realize that the only job that's going to pay me to read all day long is being a professor, right? And then kind of combined with over the years, people say, you need more graphics on your slides, right? Your slides are too text-based, right? So most of my graphics are book titles, right? So if you like books, I'm sorry, because you're going to want to hopefully buy like 30 books after this, and you'll have links to them all, right? But I am your local resource for all these books, right? So if you want to dig into these. But these are some of the books that I kind of read to understand the social psychology of brain science, like why we're wired. This one won a Nobel Prize, right? That argues that humans like to think fast. Because we can't think about everything, right? We can't look at all criteria, all variables. We have to kind of make some quick decisions. They call it heuristics, use these simple rules. One of my favorite terms in this book is we're cognitive misers. Like we don't want to think if we don't have to. But we have the ability to switch and think slow when we need to. It's that question of how do we switch from fast thinking to slow thinking when we need to. When we have a tough decision to make, when we need to kind of move forward, right? You're not smart, 46 other ways you're deluding yourself, how your brain distorts in your sleep. You see the negative kind of words coming up when people talk about how our brains work. Favorite title is What Makes Your Brain Happy and Why You Should Do the Opposite. Jonathan Haidt's work is a really nice job of thinking, particularly progressives and conservatives. What are their moral foundations? How do they kind of think differently? He's got some great TED Talks. This is a classic, I think it was written in the mid-90s, How We Know It Isn't So. For those who are working in city administration and so forth. Basically, the first book that really gets into why did people hold on to misinformation even though all the research shows they're wrong, right? You ever had that at the microphone? You can't get rid of that bad information, right? So there's reasons for that. The depth of expertise, a lot of my work is negotiating this tension between democracy and expertise, and that we need that to be a creative tension. If it's dangerous, either side of those dominates too much. Right, so how do we kind of keep that, and how do we weave? And you see with the polarization and information disorder, kind of how they feed into each other, right? The bias and the bias that divides is important. If you like this stuff, again, I got about a 60-page report. It's getting a little dated now, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, that really dives into the weeds on this. But this is the newer one that I've added, primarily because one thing that they do, he does a really nice job of establishing, basically argues that for most cognitive biases, the smarter you are and the more educated you are, the more likely you are to kind of control and kind of, lessen the impact of the bias. For my side bias, or confirmation bias, as some people, he makes distinctions that are important to that, right? But basically the bias of we seek out information that supports our perspective and ignore or kind of attack anything that challenges us, right? That bias, and particularly the smarter you are and the more educated you are, the better you are. You basically get really good at finding evidence why you're right and refuting evidence why you're wrong. So this isn't, oh, poor uneducated people are so easy to manipulate, right? No, it's my PhD friends who, some of them, and maybe me, right, figured something out 20 years ago, and I've spent 20 years proving myself right. And it really, it's kind of pushed back on my love of books, right? Because now when I'm reading a book and I'm like, this is brilliant, I'm like, brilliant? Just telling me what I'm doing here, So all of this together, and then there's a few hundred academic articles that the title turn is interesting. Here are 5 big themes I'm going to really touch on quickly. A, which I kind of just talked about, we crave certainty and consistency. Our brains are wired once we make a decision to defend it, to protect it, right? But we're suckers for a good versus evil narrative. As humans, we're very much narrative creatures. We think in terms of story. We remember information in terms of story. And our favorite story is a simple good versus evil story, with us on the good side, obviously, right? We love our heroes and our victims and our villains. And once we decide who's playing what role, we see the world through that lens. And heroes do heroic things, and villains do evil things. These are Disney villains. I've got 3 kids, so I watched lots of Disney movies over my life. The traditional Disney story is very simple, right? It's a good versus evil story. Evil was kind of hidden. Evil had bad motives. They just wanted to control the world, right? Evil was normally winning halfway through, so you get really kind of nervous, but then good would make a comeback and vanquish evil, and we live happily ever after. Right? And we train our children from a young age that all issues are about good. Like, look for the evil person, look for the wicked person. Right? We'll come back to that in a little bit. Right? Third is we're groupish. Term used most often here is tribal, political tribalism, and so forth. Tribalism is a little bit kind of broader term in a way. I like Jonathan Haidt's term of groupishness, and this will come back again because the basic idea is humans are designed to be in teams. We are very much social animals. There's a lot of good stuff from that we can tap into, and I'll talk about that specifically in the back half of this. Right? Unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of bad that comes from this too. Basically, the worst things humans have ever done is because we define an us and a them and dehumanize the them and then justify atrocities to the them. Right? So in particular, how would people come up with the us versus them? What are the identities that are kind of brought to the forefront that people kind of focus on? And this is one of the big problems with national politics because there's 2 identities. There's a red team and a blue team. So our dominant ways of talking about issues all the time is a basic 2-party zero-sum system that's bringing out the worst in human nature in lots of different ways. And then fourth, which leads to all that, is academic training is an argumentation. Like, how do you evaluate the quality of an argument and distinguish between strong arguments and weak arguments? And all those lead to, we're really bad at that. We're bad at kind of evaluating arguments well because of all these biases, because of all these kind of impacts. So since that was so important to me, I developed a kind of a whole model of these stages of motivated reasoning. The concept of motivated reasoning is we're motivated to think in a certain way. We'd like to think that we're motivated for accuracy or for truth, but the default is we're motivated to protect our team. We're motivated to protect the decisions that we've already made. So these kind of lists, when I developed this 6-7 years ago, most of these terms, I think most people haven't heard, right? Then the 2016 campaign was like motivated reasoning on steroids, right? And then all these terms, you probably recognize a lot of them, but these are like chronological stages. So we're biased on where we get information from, right? What news do we watch? Who do we have conversations from? What curated emails do we get? Right? Even if you don't do this on purpose, Facebook and Google does it for you, right? They're trying to give you what you want. Right? Second, which is probably the most important, how we, bias on what gets to our head, and then we're very biased on how we interpret that. And that's the confirmation bias that I kind of talked about a lot already. This quote's kind of haunted me for about 10 years. When we want to believe something, the question we ask is, can I believe it? There's just a little bit of evidence that fits it, like we're done, we can stop thinking, right? But when we don't want to believe something, we ask, must I believe this? And the rules of evidence are fully flipped, right? I just need a little bit of evidence that it might be wrong to dismiss it, right? And this is huge, right? Because say if you have one good example or perceived good example of the media being biased against your side, you can use that one example to justify not believing anything the media tells you about anything. Because that's our branch of life. We also have this backfire effect, which is a tough one I want to mention briefly, since y'all are really going to be bringing together the expertise and democracy throughout this program. Sometimes it gets exaggerated, right? But there's some evidence that, say if I'm trying to convince you you're wrong, but we're polarized, like we're angry. In some ways, the better my argument, right? The better the quality of the argument, the better the sources, the facts, and so forth, the more you will actually backfire. Because you'll still find something wrong with it, right? So after the exchange, she'll be thinking, oh, here comes this guy PhD with all the studies, and I still knocked it out. The reality of that, and we see different evidence, I won't be able to tell all these stories, that high quality information ejected into a polarized debate might just polarize it more. Because people take what they want, what they know otherwise. Now, I'm not saying information doesn't matter, right? I'm saying when we're polarized, facts don't work, and they often backfire and make it worse. My argument is not give up on facts. My argument is change the conversation, right? How do we depolarize when facts matter again? But you can't, if you feel the facts are on your side, that's great, right? There's one advantage of facts and being tethered to reality is it doesn't tend to change, right? So it still should be on your side. But there is very little persuasive benefit to the facts. Right? Stories are much more powerful than facts. And then, so one way I think this is the thing you want to kind of develop it, but our brains are wired to think what I call kind of catty corner or either or thinking, right? We're really good at seeing the upside of our perspective and comparing it to the downside of an opposing perspective. So it's all the reasons I'm right and all the reasons you're wrong. All the reasons she's wrong, right? And of course, she's doing the opposite, right? So you can see how it's so hard for us to have a conversation, right? Because how can anyone think like that when I'm just seeing that part? So that's either or thinking, that's how our brain generally wants to think. And then you'll see how can we make it worse and worse with politics, and then we'll end with how do we make it better over there. So we'll go back to that sometimes. Then how we make attributions, we remember information in terms of stories, which has its own bias, particularly negativity bias that we'll come back to. But our brains are much more wired for bad information than good information. That just fits more for evolutionary reasons, right? And we'll see how that's important. This is one quote that's probably now 6 or 7 years ago, after he was out of office, when the Dallas police officers were ambushed, right? But the phrase that he got here captures the literature pretty well. Too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. Our brains make assumptions about motives. We're really soft on our side and really hard on the other side. And those assumptions about motives paint everything that we hear, right? So there's one big kind of lesson from this. Whenever someone on your side is telling you what the other side truly believes, alarm bells should go off, right? Whenever someone's like, this is what they want, right? Those feel really good, right? And they're typically very, very wrong. And then how we make decisions, and then even what we remember, right? All of these are these biases that we're learning from that all kind of build on each other. So it leads to this last one, which is our brains are really bad at valuing. We don't like complexity. We prefer kind of certainty. We want simple. And you'll see why that's so bad here in a little bit. So that's individually kind of what we kind of think badly. Then then you go out in the world and interact with people, right? So I'm building this model of a vicious cycle of exaggerated polarization. So a couple of things here. A vicious cycle is a negative feedback loop, right? Polarization leads to more polarization and more polarization, right? And you do something that I think is unfair, so it kind of justifies me doing something a little unfair, but then, and it's kind of again, right? Fighting polarization with polarization that burns the whole democracy down. But it's still exaggerated. It's not real, so we can shift it. So we start with what I just walked through. We've got these blinders on because of social psychology. Negative interaction effects is when someone with a certain kind of pair of blinders on tries to have a conversation with someone else, and it tends to not go very well, right? But if you like TED Talks, Catherine Schultz's book does a great job of a whole big study of what do we do when people tell us we're wrong, right? Short version, we act badly, right? We don't like when people tell us we're wrong. She goes through these 3 steps. The first step is we make an ignorance assumption, and that's just the assumption of like, oh, they just don't know what they know. Right? Ignorance seems like such a nasty word. It just means like unaware, right? So how do we fix that? Well, we educate them, right? We tell them what we know, they don't change their mind. Right? So they have to upgrade to the idiot assumption. Right? So now they know, they just don't understand the implications of the information, right? But then after interacting with them, they seem so smart. Now this politics thing, like how can they support that person, right? So eventually she argues we go to the evil assumption. Evil's a big word here. But what the shift there is, we make an assumption about motives. Our brain is basically saying, they know I'm right. They just won't admit it because they have these bad motives. Again, once we shift to assuming bad motives of the other side, communication is useless. There's no reason to have a conversation with someone who you think is a bad faith actor that's not playing by the game, that's refusing to yield to the force of the greater argument. Now, the problem is we live in a democracy together, and if half the people don't trust the other half of the people and don't bother talking to them, it's really hard for us to deal with our shared problems, right? And then you get what I've been calling the Russell effect, which is from this beam. Like most internet memes, not quite right, but pretty close, right? In my paper, I can go through, it combines a few different things. But if you can't see that, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts. When we look at who's talking, Right? Not saying everyone's talking is a fool, right? That's thinking a little too far. But if you're sure you're right and the other side's dangerous, you're probably gonna be pretty vocal. You're gonna walk up to that microphone, right? You're gonna be pretty active on Facebook. If you're part of that exhausted middle, if you see the different sides, if you're a little bit more comfortable with the kind of uncertainty and the tensions, there's often not a place for you to speak, right? I know there's some assistant or city managers in here. I do a lot of work with ICMA and city managers, and I've asked often over the years, like, think about your most controversial issues, those that you had, 100 people lined up to talk, right? Like, did you ever have anyone walk up and say, this is such a complex issue? So on one hand, I see people doing this, but on the other hand, is it worth the cost? But no, right? Every single person that walks up is, you're an idiot if you vote for this, or you're an idiot if you don't, right? Because that's the incentive process, right? Certainty sounds persuasive, and it is, right? When people are certain that that confidence is power, right? Showing like, ooh, this is kind of hard is almost a sign of weakness or waffling or pump. The reality, as we'll get into in a second, is most of these issues are hard, right? Again, I think I'm with you, not your husband from earlier, right? Like, these are complex, right? Now, the problem is, so a lot of my work is shifting from this simple narrative to a much more complex one, but also not overcorrecting to so complex that we're stuck, right? So how do we find that happy medium of complex enough that taps into human nature in some positive ways? So again, this is the hidden, going back to the hidden tribes, the wings are the ones that are talking all the time, right? If you're active on like political Twitter or something like that, right? It's a whole different world there than most people. And to go back to the biases, right? This is that same research of the perception gaps, where they ask Republicans what Democrats think and vice versa. Guess who have the worst perception gaps? The most active people, right? The strongest kind of voices. So not only are they the loudest, but they're also the longest. Then you start getting into some of the institutions that we have, right? So you start with the internet, which brings us to the third big kind of reason we have polarization, is the internet. It was really hopeful at the beginning. This guy, Chris Bale, right, was at the beginning of the internet, and there was like, this is gonna finally make democracy work, right? It's gonna democratize information, everyone's gonna come together. 5 years later, they're like, oh shit. Yeah, this isn't working. The internet is really, really good at bringing like-minded people together, and really, really bad at bringing people together across perspectives, right? Bonding and bridging groups, it'd be like your Robert Putnam board alone kind of concepts, right? And then you look at our political system, particularly our two-party winner-take-all election political system, that incentivizes the worst of this, right? One of my favorite other book titles, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, right? Lee Drummond does some really good work about changing kind of national politics. I won't go through all of this. The summary of this slide is, unfortunately, our national political system tends to naturally reward bad arguments and punish good ones. And the issues that we're dealing with are hard enough already, with that on top of it, kind of making it worse. Right? So if you take the either or thinking that our brains are natural for, well, then it becomes this kind of either or thinking on steroids, two-party thinking, right? Because not only does it reward this, it incentivizes it a lot, right? Because if I want to get elected, I have to fire at my side, right? I have to make sure that you vote and you send me money. I don't even have to talk or think about people on the other side. So me focusing on the upside of my perspective and the downside of their perspective gets rewarded, right? Me having any kind of nuance just doesn't fit elections at all. Even worse, going back to negativity bias, right? Politics very much rewards staying on the bottom, focusing on how bad the other side is and how they cause all the problems. One of the metaphors I heard lately was like, what would happen if the airline industry did advertisements like the political industry? Right? Like every single ad is how bad the other one, like no one would ever fly. Right? That's why Congress was at 4%, right? Because every single election, all we're hearing is how horrible the other side is, right? And then very simplistic magic bullets, elect me and I'll fix everything. Right? So we should take that basic human nature and make it a lot worse. To take it down to more the local level, what I did in my longer report was, once I understood kind of this perspective and how social psychology works, looking at how we engage people, and you see how, I would say about 95% of our public processes are pretty badly designed, right? Is one time at the microphone or just collecting opinions or doing surveys or answering emails, all those are just collecting individual opinions, which are pretty problematic because it's people from blinders on, right? You're giving a lot more credence to the people that feel comfortable speaking, but those are probably the people that are most polarized and seeing things through the lens. Very little kind of engagement and talking to each other in some important ways. Particularly too often with a controversial issue, the focus is on a yes/no issue, right? That we engage the public once, hey, we're going to do this. Right? That's bad in two ways. One is, and I tell them all the time, like, for that kind of meeting, everyone walking in the door has already answered yes or no, right? So they're not there to think, they're not there to solve problems, they're not there to learn, they're there to fight for their perspective, right? And on top of that, because of the activity bias, right? Most people that show up with a tough issue are going to be against a change. Just think about it. If you read about something your school district's doing that you like, you're like, well, that's a good idea. And you go on with your day. If you read something the school district's doing that you don't like, you're like, well, hell no. And you show up, right? So we oversample very much the no's on anything like that, right? You're not having a very good conversation. And all of this leads to, what I'll talk about the rest of the time, is most of our public processes, rarely do we actually have to engage each other and have conversation. You can see why that's so important. And then the last thing is the media, which is the fourth one here. The media, unfortunately, especially national media, especially national partisan media, thrives on conflict as well. They know that's what sells. They understand social psychology. They know what we want, right? So then dramatizing things draws the clicks. And then now, particularly with this new world of media, with everything online and so forth, we've lost our big newspapers that had a huge incentive to speak to a broad audience because their money was from advertising. Now all the money is in smaller audiences, right? Social media, most media is designed to divide us up into little pieces so they can sell us. So again, all the incentives are divide us versus bring us together. We've lost all our institutions that bring us together. We need to recreate them. Right? And then last, so this negative feedback leads to what we are now, right? Politics is mostly this anecdote wars, right? Find the worst example of the other side and spread it to everyone else. There's an outraged industrial complex, right? People getting really, really rich. I mentioned earlier, my job is to design processes to avoid triggering the worst human nature and tapping the best. There's a whole bunch of people that get paid a lot more than me doing the opposite, right? And they're kind of going with the flow, right? They're triggering the easy parts of human nature. Like I'm literally trying to not trigger that part. Like I need to trigger this back part over here, light that up, right? Which we're figuring out how to do. Right now, this is really scary and really dark, right? The good news is in 20 minutes, by the time I end, we're like, okay, we can do this, right? Because once we understand this, we know how to change it. We're just not using the back knowledge yet. You know, the national political system is very much not designed to do it. Local communities can. So this mean-spirited contempt that we have in our politics that, I mean, I know we've had a civil war, so it's hard to say that we're polarized for the network, right? But in terms of how we're responding to polls and how do we talk about the other side, it's really dangerous. Pew Research has been doing polls every 10 years, asking questions like, do you think the other party is a threat? The other question is, would you be willing to allow your child to marry someone from the other party, right? Used to be, sure, who cares, right? And you see, this is 94, 2004, 2014, how much it's increased. I've been waiting literally for 8 years for the 2024 report. We're in 2024. I emailed them a month ago. They said, yeah, we're not doing one this year. Like, what? Where do you think it'll be? Well, I found this, which is pretty close. Asking if Trump and Biden supporters, if you think the other side wins, would it be lasting harm? And we're now at 90%. Right? What used to be 16% is now 90%. Like, we are more divided by party than anything else. Religion, or gender, race, or whatever. All of those have kind of kept normal, and then party as a particular thing that triggers us and them has just exploded. So that leads to the assumption of negative motives, which I've been saying undermines everything. It undermines the role of facts and expertise. That stuff doesn't matter in a polarized environment. And then it fuels conspiracy theory and bad faith actors, which is the last thing is, we have people out there that are profiting from the conflict, that are feeding us the narratives that we need. Amanda Ripley used the term conflict entrepreneurs that I like, but generally people that are purposely dividing us, not wanting to solve the issue, but to do other things. So that's all the bad news. Right? Maybe the most important thing here is all of this drowns out legitimate concerns. We have real issues like water that we need to figure out how to deal with. And all of this stuff is distracting us. All of this stuff is sucking up the air, all the oxygen, and taking all our time, and getting really good people to not want to get involved in any of this. right? Because it seems like a very, very bad game. That being said, the bad news is what I just told you. We're naturally wired as humans for this bad stuff. And then there's lots of systems, the dominant systems that we use to try to talk about issues, tend to make those worse. The good news, though, is we had to get the deep dive in social psychology and brain science. Most of it was bad news, right? But there was a lot of good news. So how do we change how we talk to each other to tackle the good news? And interesting right here, because you have like a mix of politicians and leaders, but then also some business people, right? A lot of what I'll be talking about for the next 20 minutes is pulling from business. Right? And part of the reality is business leaders have figured out we have to have tough conversations and recognize tensions and work through these things better to make better, to come up with better ideas and solutions. Right? Our political system is really lacking because the two-party political system doesn't incentivize. You can get elected and elected and elected playing this bad game. You don't ever solve any problems very well, right? So what we're learning is how do we take all these new concepts from management that are figuring out how to overcome human nature and spark better conversations and apply it. Right? So what can we do about it then? So one is to adopt a wicked problems mindset. How many of you have heard the term wicked problems? It's always interesting in different groups. So maybe about a third ago or so. So it's been out there for 50 years. I have a little bit of a different kind of take on it that I'll kind of explain. And then once we think about things as wicked problems, that changes the way we talk to each other. And you'll be seeing that kind of here, right? So wicked problems traditionally has been seen as a category of problems. So one's like a simple problem, a complex problem, or a wicked problem, right? Developed initially by engineers. Actually, the quick story is engineers that got trained in the classroom and then started working for a city, right? They're like city planners, civil engineers. And they realized pretty quickly that the problems they felt they were trained to solve and the problems they were asked to solve were very different, right? So they were trained to solve technical problems, right? And here's the right answer. But then when they're dealing with cities, they figured out like, hey, all these problems have all these inherent values to them. And then different people prioritize those values and they're all yelling at me. And they're like, wait a second, there's not a technical solution to this. Right? So it's a completely different skill set they switch. They actually call them tame and wicked. Right? So tame might be really, really complex, but there's a right answer. Experts solve things. We're awash with wicked problems. I like to see it less in the category of problems, but like a lens through which to see problems. So a tool you'll have in your toolkit here after 10 minutes, right? You can step back with an issue and say, if I look at this as a wicked problem, how does that change the conversation? How might that open up space for people to come together in some different ways? How does that help kind of avoid tripping the worst of human nature and maybe tap into some of the good parts of human nature, right? So you see the definition is wicked problems inherently involve multiple competing values that don't fit together, that can't be resolved by science. And then, in a diverse community, different people would, prioritize those values differently. Now, here's the really interesting part of it. Every year when I come here, I use water as my first example to explain wicked problems, primarily because most people don't really think about water that much, right? So I can explain this complex issue, but not too many people would like react to it, right? But here, it's the opposite. You're all here to talk about water for the next couple months, right? But I still can find it. So I create these wicked problem slides. This is one of the tools that's useful. And it's retraining your brain to basically look for the underlying values. When you're engaging a tough issue, what are the things that everyone cares about here? Identify those underlying values and put them on the table. And then recognize that there's going to be some natural tension. So I created this with the CSU Water Institute 15 years ago or so, right? Before this program started, before the Coulda Runs Through It kind of program started yearly. We had about 300 people come to an event. I had these little half sheets of paper asking some open-ended prompts. When you think about the river, what concerns you, what are your hopes for it, so we have all these questions. We don't tend to talk about values nationally, but we don't say, I care about safety, therefore, but whenever we define a problem, whenever we define a goal, whenever we make an argument for a specific idea to do something, inherently there's values involved, right? A problem in some ways is, a value is being disrespected, we need to change, right? A goal is, hey, we want to go somewhere better where values are, it's a better mix of value, right? Or if I'm arguing we should do X, it's because X leads to Y, and Y is a good thing, right? So you start retraining your brain to look for the underlying values, identify those. So these are 9 kind of interest things people care about when they talk about water. So wicked problem in a couple different ways. One is if you look at these one at a time, and purposely when I define a box in the wicked problem slide, I try and define it positively. Like reasonable people could care about this, right? That's why I say something like economic vitality versus like greed, right? Having a vibrant economy is important, right? So each of these are kind of good things. Reasonable people can care about them. Different people will rank them differently, certainly. I'm also not saying that they're all equal. Certainly some are going to be naturally more important to more people or to a community than others. And that's part of the tough conversation we need to have. But start with this assumption that reasonable people can care about these things. What makes them wicked is these don't fit together very well. There's natural tensions between these. Maybe not a zero sum, but if we focus on one of these boxes, it's probably going to make it harder to focus on some other boxes. That's the conversation we need to have. How do we negotiate these tensions? How do we as a community figure out how do we kind of deal with these natural tensions? That is not the conversation we naturally have. What our brains want to do is pick one box at a time, right? I care about the environment and the health of the river. So if you disagree with me, he hates rivers. It's easy. That's his motive, right? His motive is he just cares so much about money, cares less about polluting, right? So then I don't ever have to talk to him, right? Our brains don't like to think about wicked problems. We like to think about wicked people. Problems are caused by bad people with bad values. That makes us feel good. That makes all our friends that we're talking about them feel good. It doesn't help us actually solve the problem. Because one reality is very few people self-identify as wicked. Right? And if you tell someone you have really bad values and bad beliefs, they don't tend to react very well. Right? So again, even if they're wrong pragmatically, figure out what they really care about. Put that on the surface and then figure out how you will. And that's the kind of big shift from these kind of talking, right? So the conversations I try to spark, the long term is balancing. Okay, how do we find the right balance between these things? And that's a conversation that's never going to end, right? You don't come up with a solution to a wicked problem. It's not like we're going to figure it out and implement it, and then boom, we never have to deal with sufficient. We have perfected how to teach K-12, right? We have perfected housing, right? Everyone said that, no. Those are always going to be these tough issues because they inherently involve so many different things. So qualities can be communities can be defined by the quality of the ongoing conversation of this constant kind of process of tweaking and balancing. The second conversation, more short term, is like recalibrating. You might realize that, hey, one value's dominated too much, or one value's been left behind, or maybe there's a new value that we haven't thought of before, right? Like when rivers started catching fire in the 1970s, like, maybe we should think, and we need to recalibrate things. So wicked problems mindset can allow us for activism, allow us for really strong opinions. But I want it within a context of multiple values that recognizes there's going to be tensions. Anytime, and this happens on the right and on the left, anytime an issue is framed around one value, alarm bells go off. That's not going to be a good conversation. Because that inherently frames it as one side's got good values and the other side is defined by being against something. We love to define the people we disagree with by what they're against, because that makes us feel good. That doesn't help us work on problems better. And the best conversation, not always possible, is a transcendent conversation. And that's when once we recognize these tensions between values, and you care more about one and I care more about the other, well, we both care about both of them, right? We just rate them differently. Can we now be creative and work together and figure out a way to get both at the same time? Right? The biggest advantage of human nature, the positive aspect of human nature that I'll get to in a few minutes, is we're really good creative problem solvers when put in a good situation. But we're also cognitive misers. We don't want to have to think and we don't have to, right? So we just assume the problem is caused by bad people, then we're good, right? Switching from the easy assumption of problems caused by wicked people to wicked problems allows us to kind of now, hey, now let's work it. Instead of me against you face to face, now we're shoulder to shoulder working at the problem. Right? And that's where we kind of come up with win-win situations or innovative ways to kind of do both, right? So I'm going to fly through these. This is one we did on Steamboat about food is a wicked problem. Same basic idea. Each box is a good thing, but they don't fit together very well, right? Healthcare can be really complex, but really we want these three things, and those three things don't fit together. But this is one that we did in downtown Fort Collins after a survey of about 3,000 people. What do you want out of Fort Collins? We actually designed the whole process just around this. This one, the concept of sustainability. Can't tell the whole story now, but I've taught social movement classes, and one year I focused just on the environmental movement, just kind of hear the whole history. And part of that history was it used to be this purely just adversarial, the environment versus the economy, right? But then there was a small kind of wing of the environmental movement that said, if that's the fight, I think we're going to lose. because they have a whole bunch more power than us. Right? So they say, how about we reframe this and go from a single bottom line, which is just profit, to a triple bottom line and say, hey, you know what? The economy's good. Right? Let's not demonize capitalism and not demonize kind of the developers, right? But let's say, hey, profit's good, people are good, and the planet's good. And how do we that is a wicked problems frame. We care about those three things. Those three things don't tend to fit together very well. How do we kind of work together? Right? Clean energy is huge to CO2 in northern Colorado. Right? A well-paying clean energy job is good for people, good for the planet, it's good for the environment. Yeah. And the economy, sorry. Right? So now we're working, instead of kind of attacking each other, right, now we're working together to develop these. How do we kind of shift other issues to them? When an issue is primarily defined by adversarial forces, the conversation can be poor. The bad thing is, in a two-party national system, the dominant way we talk about issues is right versus left. So we're sticking everything into that either or, two-party thinking, right? This is what we did for Platte River Power Authority. I know there's some power people. I remember, 6 years ago, we did this project helping them. Their mission statement was, the Platte River will safely provide reliable, environmentally responsible, and financially sustainable energy. I'm reading their mission statement. I'm like, that's a wicked problem. Right? We want those three things. Those three things don't fit together very well. As battery technology gets better and cheaper, those tensions are decreasing. Right? But the reality of solar and wind, which are really good for the environment, don't tend to be reliable. So they need to buy batteries, which are really expensive. But we don't like to see those tensions. We want to take one at a time. So how do we change that conversation and kind of work together? Right? I don't have time to do all these. So this is my COVID one. The really quick kind of version of this is, unlike all the other ones, public health is centered and larger. So I'm kind of saying from the beginning, we have to prioritize public health when we thought about the reaction to COVID. But we should have also considered these other values. Because we know when we define people by what they're against, they just hate facts, they hate science, they don't care if grandma dies. That doesn't tend to go well. And that's just polarized more, right? And the sad reality that even a global pandemic divided us more instead of actually being a common maybe that was together. So bottom line here is democracy is a wicked problem. These are just 5 basic values that I pull from basically from the preamble, kind of adjusting it. These are in the academic literature, they're called God terms, these powerful words, values that work in so many different ways. We tend to use them one at a time, but they don't fit together very well. There's some inherent tensions between these big values that underlie almost every issue that we deal with. We don't tend to talk about it. Particularly when you have one party talking about one value, the other party talking about another value, and we don't talk about the tension, right? So part of what I've done is I reframe the brain, and I'll admit sometimes now I've got a hammer so everything looks good, but I look for the tensions, right? The first conversation I have at a coffee shop about a new project, right? I'm trying to figure out, okay, what are the tensions, the paradoxes, the dilemmas that really define this issue that no one's talking about, right? That I can watch them on the microphone and I can see people talking past each other, but no one's talking about the tension, right? So how do you make sense of the noise out there, all that data out there? The city will send you all the emails they got on an issue, right? We'll do a survey, right? We have all this collection of individual opinion. We turn that into, okay, what are the things people care about and what are the kind of big tensions? How do we redirect the conversation there? Because that's where we actually move forward on an issue, right? So just within those values, there's some pretty big tensions. And then here are just some of the other ones that are kind of constantly kind of dealing with. That just don't tend to be an inherent part of the conversation. So looking at wicked problems, they'll deal with wicked problems well. You need high quality communication. You need people from different kind of perspectives. You need to get people's brains to work in a way they're not used to working. So that's why we need better processes. We need bridging institutions. We need facilitators. And I'll end here in a few minutes with the good news that the more you do this, the easier it is to do. You start retraining your brain. So, so presume wicked problems, not wicked people. And I'm not saying there's not wicked people at all. It's just there's much fewer wicked people than you think, right? No one self-identifies as wicked, like I said. So even pragmatically, if the problem is wicked people, like if the problem truly is powerful people purposely oppressing us to stay in power, I think they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other in facts on that. Right? Makes it really easy for them to stay there, right? As we elevate conversations and we make connections in our communities, that we can take on that much better ways, right? Be more comfortable with uncertainty. There is kind of a shift in leadership. I think part of this is to make literate leaders. From traditional leadership of like charisma, rah, fire people up, mobilize your side, which can still be important in crisis situations. That tends to backfire and polarize information, polarize empowerment for their right? So the superpower 21st century leaders need the ability to bring people together across perspectives. The skill set is a very different skill set that we need to kind of be teaching. And you'll get, part of this in this show, in this process, right? Part of the problem is we elect these people, and once they're elected, we expect them to act like these. It's just a different skill set. Less so in a local community, right? We elect local leaders that are, because a local leader has to solve problems. They can't keep on getting elected playing a political game, right? Since that's again the reality of local works a lot better. Focus on elevating conversation, not winning the argument, right? We have more and more people that are there not to win, but to help you have a better conversation that starts transforming the conversation. So we need our leaders to be thinking like that. Put your energy towards identifying intentions. I've talked about that kind of plenty. And then how do we build this funding together? This ongoing conversation to deal with how we get problems kind of better. This is one aspect of building that in our community. So the last couple of minutes here. Earlier, I showed you all the bad news. This is the good news, right? Some key aspects of human nature that are really positive. We're actually pretty much the most cooperative species that exists, right? In so many different ways. There's really interesting books that kind of get to this. So how do we tap into it? How do we tap into the power of us without having to rely on the negative power of them, right? Or actually, one new concept I've come up with, see if y'all like this. Is there such thing as like a benign them? Right? Like for Fort Collins, can we like demonize Boulder, right? We're not going to invade Boulder, right? But just like, this idea of competing against Boulder, does that bring us together, right? So there are ways of kind of playing it. But these are just some books that really kind of get to that positive side of things. Of what's motive. People want purpose, people want to kind of, we actually agree on so much. It's just our system highlights what we disagree with, blows it up, right? So how do we tap into that kind of sense of purpose? How do we tap into, we are naturally empathetic. Talking to real people rehumanizes them, makes connections. Conflict management people, even people dealing with like white supremacist groups and jihadists know that a real conversation can kind of overcome that. It's really hard to hate up close, right? So that's again the advantage that we have local. How do we get real people talking to each other? But one quick thing with the empathy, it's a little bit scary. Some research shows that the more empathetic you are, the easier you are to polarize because you empathize with the victim and get really, really angry at the perceived villain. So there are some complexities there that we're having to deal with. And third, like I said, we're inherently pragmatic and creative. How do we tap into that? For those who do a lot of public engagement stuff, shifting from the public being a problem to manage, right? Or this like, okay, we have to have meetings, people can scream at us for 20 minutes, right? Shifting that to the public being a resource, the public being collaborative problem solvers that are not only, they're actually helping you come up with better ideas versus that's what we're trying to shift to, right? And that people can actually get joy and enjoyment out of that. And then lastly, while all the negative stuff is easier to trigger, the reality is our brains change. Individuals can develop better habits, organizations can develop norms, communities can kind of develop cultures in a way. So how do we start doing more and more and kind of learn from that as we go? Because while facts don't change minds and they might kind of backfire in certain ways, what changes minds is a genuine conversation with someone that thinks differently than you, that you develop some sort of trust relationship with. How do we cultivate those? So many organizations divide us. How do we get more organizations that mix together? This room is an example that we got people from some different perspectives and some different parts of the town, some urban and rural, hey, there's a lot of potential here to help us as a region talk about water in a very different way, right? So the work that I do, lots of different words for it. I won't go through all this. These are when I design meetings, you'll see some components of this, but these are the tricks of the trade of how to spark a very different conversation, avoid tripping up words and tap into the conversation. But what we're trying to do is switch from the either or thinking to both and thinking, right? To fill in the blanks, right? And it's not both and thinking. There's a negative both and thinking like, well, it's both, right? But we just need balance. My students are trained that whenever anyone says, we just need both or we need balance, okay, what would that balance look like, right? How much of each? If we're out of balance, which direction are we, right? So it's not just both and like a murky middle that we're happy we're out of extremes. No, it's the tough conversation of where, right? of recognizing, yes, there's a downside of my perspective and there's an upside of opposing perspective. And this is the magic of this when we have a really good conversation, because I'm not probably changing my mind. Our brain wants me to be 100% right. Well, once you recognize, I can admit some flaws, some drawbacks, right? And I can recognize that the other side's got some good ideas. I probably still think the ratio of upside to downside is much better on my side than their side, right? But in the process of actually filling out the map and kind of filling in my blind spots, we also kind of realize, wait a second, I like some of your upside, right? And I agree. So on my back, like maybe now we shift and we work together. How do we stay on the top and avoid the bottom? Right? And that's that shift from adversarial to collaborative that kind of changes the conversation in some important ways. So these are some of the books that talk about that, a different way of thinking. Most of these are coming from the business community that we're now translating to politics, particularly kind of local collaborative problem solving to do that. So, in the middle. Oh, looks like I went off screen also. Okay, well, I'm pretty much. So you can look on the slides, but the last slide, well, I have these 4 shifts. So I'm going to switch from kind of assuming wicked people to wicked problems, right? That switches from triggering the worst of human nature to the best. That switches also from facts as being kind of ammunition that we attack or fake news that we ignore to facts helping us, right? When we're in collaborative mode, we want good information. And I showed you the vicious cycle, the negative feedback loop. The last slide is the positive feedback loop. The more you do this, the easier it is to do. You have an experience and a good conversation that creates a relationship with someone who might think differently. Now you have a resource to tap into. Now when you're going to a meeting, you're not there, there's a fight for your perspective and convince people you're right. Right? A public meeting now becomes a chance to refine your opinion and improve your opinion through conversation. And then we get to this point of kind of co-creation working together. And we know from the research, the more you do that, the easier it is to do. So that's what we're hoping to do, give you these skills here, give you a lot of information and data to deal with the information disorder. These are the tools to kind of deal with polarization. And then y'all become the leaders that help us in the broader community have these conversations. So I'm out of time. Know lots of people here working for cities and so forth. I want to be a resource to y'all, so have my contact information there. I'll hang around a little bit. I know y'all they're all doing stuff. You want to ask questions, but so thanks a lot for your time. I know I threw a lot at you talking through. I was trying to leave some time for Q&A, but there's plenty of little stories about your film. So
could you give 1 or 2 examples of where people will come here on a discussion of working problem led to a short-term result that embodied several different values?
yeah, so part of, well, actually, probably the first big process we ever did was for the school district. This was now 16, 17 years ago. Now somebody over here, Cooter School District switched from K-6, and they had 3-year junior highs and 3-year high schools, which is really weird, right? So the new superintendent wanted to move the 6th graders up to junior high and the 9th graders up to high school, mainly because everyone wanted 9th graders in high school, right? But then everyone wanted 6th graders in elementary school, right? Because everyone knows junior high school, right? So like taking a year of childhood away. So what happened is it polarized and the superintendent became the devil figure, right? So we designed these meetings, and one of my first big meetings ever, it was so hilarious, that sounded like in the hall of it was at Fossil High School, I think. And we had like 4 rooms going, right? And I'm talking to the superintendent. Well, the principal of school walked out of the room, it's like, look on his face and walked up to me. It's crazy. I'm like, what happened? He's like, so there's a woman at a table that was just like railing on it. Like, this is ridiculous. This is dumb. Mainly because she had like 4th and 5th graders that were going to, go too early, right? Well, then across the table was a mother of a 9th grader saying, okay, my son has to go, can't take the classes that he needs to take. And then he's getting bussed twice a day for sports and back, And then the first one was like, I never thought of it. That makes sense. He had never seen someone change their mind in a public process. Because most of the public processes were one at a time in the mind. Let's speak your piece on the next person, right? An actual interaction. And she's like, oh, I didn't do that. So then they started shifting, okay, how do we make this work, right? How do we deal with it? And, it's a wicked problem. There's no right answer, right? You can't, because leaving the 6th graders and moving the 9th graders gives you 2-year junior highs. That doesn't work. Both years are transition. So it just kind of, you saw the aha moment. And these aha moments aren't, oh, I'm wrong, right? It's, oh, the other side's not evil, right? They make sense. And then that motivates you to kind of try to find it over. The other quick example, probably our best story, is the Partnership for Age-Friendly Community, which I also see as a key bridge organization. So it started out of meetings about called the silver tsunami, the percentage of our population that's aging, right? I think at a time when we started out about 12 years ago, the number was the percentage over 65 was going to increase 115% over the next 5 years, like more than double. The percentage over 80 was going to like triple. So it's all about what kind of community we want for our residents. And sparked a lot of conversation. We actually ended up creating a new 501c3 that didn't exist before that now kind of continues doing. For me, it's this perfect organization because it's an advocacy organization that focuses on that issue, but they're very open-minded and collaborative about how to deal with it. Right? So it's not like they found a solution and they're kind of trying to sell that solution. Like, no, they got a problem they care about and they want to spark really good conversations. But the powerful thing that they've done is so many of that conversation started with what the government needs to do to fix all these things. Right? Well, through the conversation, it was a recognition like, yeah, there's a role for government, there's a role for nonprofits, there's a role for private businesses that think differently about it. And, you know, people outlive their ability to drive by 10 years. Right. So then now there's an economic incentive to figure out how do you deliver things, you know. So it was just this fascinating thing of figuring out, okay, there's lots of different ways of we as a community. You know, the deliberative process I do try to do that. It's the overall question is, hey, what should we do about X? X being some sort of problem. But the we is purposely broad. Like, yes, government is an important tool, but one tool among many, right? How do we, you know, tap into lots of other different ways to do that? And that's one particular way of bringing Democrats and Republicans together, right? Because like, we're not assuming from the beginning government's always the best thing to do. Right?
All right, thank you, Marie. Take the last 10-ish minutes of class to get in your table right now. And hopefully one of you has a computer. If not, you can always take notes and transmit via smoke signal. Hold up. Go around your group and share out start with the first question, key takeaways. That can be anything that was surprising to you, something that you're like, oh yeah, I never thought about that before. I'm really gonna take that with me after today. If you get to question number 2, what other questions are you left with? And number 3 is more kind of internalizing, how does that apply to you in your work? Hopefully a notator can put that all down. Doesn't have to be, you know, paragraphs and paragraphs, just some short descriptions, and send it to Alex.
Can you include everybody's name?
And include everyone's name on your note taking. Okay, thank you. Thanks for.
Do about what? Trash. Oh, yeah, basically. Hold on, let me do this real quick. I'm trying to.
It's not, well, should we look at the questions back on?
Yeah, sorry, hold on.
Much better.